Hello, and welcome to Climate Matters. I'm your host, Lyn Schad, and I'm a member of the Falmouth Climate Action Network. Climate Matters hopes to encourage climate conversations. Some will be easy, some will be tough. Have them with your friends, your families, and yes, even those with a different point of view. Let's help one another understand the impact of climate change on our coastal town. Together, we can plan for a more sustainable future for Falmouth. Hello, I'm here today with Dr. Mike Fogarty. He's a retired scientist from NOAA, right here in our very own Woods Hole. Mike, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Lyn.
We're going to be talking today about what's happening to the fishing industry with regards to the effect climate change has on that. But could you give us a little bit of your background and how you got involved with the fishing industry? Because you have a very long career, don't you?
Yeah, I'm old. Yeah, well, I got interested in marine biology pretty early on. I grew up in Rhode Island, where you can't get very far from a beach, and I became very interested in trying to snorkel. So my folks agreed to get me a snorkeling set, and it just opened up an entire new world for me. You know, below the ocean, or below the water.
Yeah, right.
So, can I try that again? Yeah, I was interested in marine biology from a very early age. I had become interested in snorkeling, and because I grew up in Rhode Island, very close to a lot of different beaches, I had a chance to actually find out more about what was under those waves with my snorkeling set.
Pretty fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, it's gorgeous. Yeah. I mean, you don't get a real sense of it until you're actually under there and seeing things.
What comes to my mind is there's sort of snorkeling up here in the northern waters, and then there's snorkeling in what we all imagine to be like these beautiful, clear, Caribbean-colored waters. But it's still beautiful here. It's still very beautiful, right?
Yeah, it's gorgeous. And actually, even though it's less clear than the Caribbean, it's a sign of productivity of the waters, because what you're really, part of what is blocking your vision is phytoplankton production, microscopic plants that are really enriching an entire ecosystem.
So there's more in our waters here than there is in Caribbean waters?
There's more, we have more nutrients, and so it's clearer for that reason. It also can be, of course, more turbid in some cases from runoff from the land and so on. But yeah, they're very different ecosystems, and the way a Caribbean ecosystem works is more in terms of recycling nutrients, whereas we're getting a fresh supply.
Can you explain that a little bit? What do you mean by recycling
basically,
nutrients?
well, of course, you know, when you're thinking about an ecosystem as a whole, you've got energy that's being taken from the sun to these microscopic plants mostly, but also seaweeds and so forth. And then they in turn serve as an energy source for a lot of other organisms in the ecosystem as a whole, but there's usually a continual renewal of those nutrients from a number of different sources. In the Caribbean, it's quite different in the sense that there's not a lot of nutrients that are coming in off the land, the islands themselves. And so the ecosystems have adapted in a way that actually uses the energy that is available in a pretty efficient way. And a large part of it is through bacterial action, some of the things you don't really think about so much.
It happens more in those waters than it happens up here.
Well, it's more important to the overall energy supply in the system. Yeah, it happens in ours as well, of course. You know, so when
and what is it about the topography of those more Caribbean the terrain, let's call it terrain, that's different than up here so that it doesn't draw those nutrients?
Well, it's principally because it's generally sandy, in some case crushed coral surfaces, and so the plant life isn't quite as rich as it is here in the sense of the overall amount that we have. And that in turn, for example, falling leaves and so forth, all come into our systems. They actually, bacteria break that down and release the nutrients that were contained in those products. And then one way or another, it gets washed into the sea through river systems and so on. So it's just a different kind of structure altogether than in the Caribbean. But it's every bit as fascinating when you're snorkeling here or diving for that matter, which I eventually got into.
Yeah. What areas did you like to dive around here?
Well, when I was growing up in Rhode Island, most of my diving, and particularly for my research, was in Jamestown, Rhode Island.
Okay.
Yeah, beautiful place, just across the bay from Newport.
Sure.
And but yeah, gorgeous place.
Yeah. So tell us how you arrived at NOAA.
Well, I had gotten my PhD at the University of Rhode Island, and I was initially working for the State Department of Environmental Management, but I came in contact with colleagues that we were working on similar projects, some of whom were from Woods Hole, and I got an offer to come to Woods Hole, and if you're a marine biologist, that's like being asked, would you like to go to heaven?
Yeah, right.
You know, something like that. So,
and at that time, was NOAA the only laboratory that was there in Woods Hole?
No, by the time it was well established, but you know, folks might find it interesting to know that, of course, the fishing industry was the first industry in the United States altogether, so it's been important in the cultural and economic fabric of the country ever since then. And it happened that Congress decided to investigate how they could make things more productive in the fisheries in the early 1800s. So they assigned Spencer Fullerton Baird, who is the deputy director of the Smithsonian Institution, to start an investigation into the productivity of our ocean waters. And he ultimately chose Woods Hole as a site to really establish the first marine laboratory in the nation. So that work, his work, began in the early 1870s, but this building came to fruition, a very well-equipped and modern laboratory in 1885.
Wow, wow, that goes way back. But at that time, the fishing industry, as you said, was very well established. It was,
yeah, it was really vital to the overall social and economic structure of the, not only Cape Cod, of course, but elsewhere.
And then, of course, the area is named Cape Cod. I don't know what the origins of that is, but it's named Cape Cod because cod was the was the fish of the day from
it's always been
times.
It's been really the centerpiece for a very long time until recently, the fishing industry in New England overall. But yeah, we got our name from an early explorer, Matthew Gosnold, who noted, as did many other explorers, just the wealth of the oceans here. And they were particularly taken by cod and also by lobster in terms of the abundance at that time. So it became, we got our name through that source overall. But,
I'm glad we weren't called Cape Lobster.
Yeah, it's not, doesn't have the same thing.
Doesn't have the same ring.
Yeah.
That would be hard to put it on in the bushes on the rotary as you come over board.
But in any case, you know, when I was doing my research, I wasn't really, my PhD research, I wasn't really focused on fishing per se. I was more interested in doing basic ecological studies and developing and applying mathematical models to an ecosystem, which happened to be this one off Jamestown that I was looking at. But as I would cross over fields of lobster traps along the way out to my dive site, it really hit me then. Of course, I knew lobsters were important commercially, but it really hit me that I also needed to understand more about the human side of what's going on in these systems and how we affect them and so on. So I began to take courses in fisheries biology.
And you're at NOAA at this point when you're still in Rhode Island?
Well, still in Rhode Island as I'm describing this part of it now,
Okay.
yeah. But then I actually pivoted when I understood just how important the fishing industry and how humans fit into the ecosystem really was, that I wanted to learn more about it. And I ultimately, after completing my PhD, started to work with lobstermen when I was working for the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management. And I really came to respect them very deeply for their knowledge and what they were willing to teach me about what they knew about lobsters. But at the time, we would be doing a number of different projects, including tagging lobsters and seeing how far they moved. And that was something that fascinated the lobstermen as well. So I came away with a whole different appreciation of how you understand humans in an ecosystem.
So what exactly do you mean by that in terms of how humans have affected the fishing industry? I mean, there's fish in the ocean. We want to eat fish. We discovered at some point that eating fish was a good thing, and it provided us with nourishment. So that introduced people long time ago into fishing.
Yeah.
But now, then it became not just something for subsistence, but also an industry, a livelihood for people.
Yeah.
And you're saying that the introduction of that aspect of it has...
Well, it's really the understanding, first of all, of course, all humans, like all other animals, take resources from our environment. And of course, we require them. And of course, fish is particularly nutritious. My mother told me when I was starting very young that fish was brain food. I think she was trying to get me to, go along with eating fish sticks or something.
Yeah,
but,
right.
But it turns out she's right. I
Yeah.
mean, it's a very healthy, and particularly for your brain because the omega-3s and other nutrients and vitamins in it.
Right.
So, I mean, that part of it is normal. And of course, in other prehistoric times, we would be usually gathering our own food. But now things, of course, as society developed, things get more partitioned. So we have people who play that service for us. And so that's an important service overall. And of course, what we were interested in is finding out, well, what are safe levels of harvesting overall so that we keep things in bounds and we don't overstrip the resource and its capabilities.
So it remains a balanced, cyclical environment.
Well, of course, it's changed from the natural state, but it can, if it's done properly, really recalibrate to a different kind of system that does include quite specifically humans. And so that understanding how that part of it works and how to try to avoid problems really is at the heart of what fisheries biology is about.
I would think a really big contributor to the human element has been our contribution to climate change and its effect on the fish, the environment, and the fishing industry.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about what that, how is that manifesting itself? Like what are the things about climate change that are affecting the water and subsequently affecting the fish?
Yeah. So it's been, of course, this is not a new phenomenon. It's been going on for several decades now in terms of this accelerated rate of change that we're seeing, but we're seeing...
It goes back farther than that, though, doesn't it?
Yeah,
like
of
even
course,
the
naturally.
Late 1800s?
Well, there have always been inputs to humans in different ways, whether it's polluting the seas or over-harvesting and other factors that have changed those ecosystems as well, and that's very long-standing. And you're right, at the very end of the 1800s, when the Industrial Revolution was coming on, and we were putting more and more
They started
carbon
to notice
dioxide
that,
into the
yeah.
ocean. Yeah, it began to change, but it really accelerated in the mid-century, our last century.
So like the
It really-
50s, 1950s?
Yeah, really
Wow.
starting to pick up, and then
Not
now
that
more
long ago.
dramatically since then.
Mm-hmm.
But so it's really been something that's an evolving process, but one that's becoming increasingly problematic
Yeah.
because of the levels that we're reaching. But to answer your original question, Lynn, so we're affecting the temperature.
Mm-hmm.
We're also affecting the acidity of the water itself. So this problem of ocean acidification that probably most folks have heard about is a really important issue overall for the health of the oceans. And of course, it naturally affects bivalves, clams, scallops, and so on quite intensively because of so much their shell is actually made up of calcium carbonate. And so it really is an important part, but if the levels get too high, then of course it becomes problematic. If the acidity levels become too high.
It softens the shells.
It does soften them, and as a result, it reduces the survival rate of those animals and growth rates too.
So, would these changes be happening anyway over time, but just over a longer period of time? Like, somewhere back in our history, hundreds of thousands of years ago, was there was there warming of the ocean? Was there acidification of the ocean due to other things? Maybe there was some, I don't know, some sort of atmospheric event that occurred that caused those things.
Yeah, well, we certainly, yes, we've certainly gone through cycles on long time scales, very long time scales. And some of them would affect things like the acidification. A large volcanic event, for example, can have important effects not only in the atmosphere, but in the ocean, changing temperatures overall, in that case, decreasing them because the sunlight can't get through, but also the particulate matter that goes into the ocean. So yeah, that part of the story is not unexpected in general long-term, from a long-term perspective, but really what we're seeing now is a rate of change that's quicker than anything we've ever seen.
And so more difficult to adapt for
it's
species
more difficult
and
to
environments to adapt.
and we can also relate it quite directly to the levels of carbon dioxide that are going out into the atmosphere. So there is a clear recognition of that connection in the human part of this story. So one of the concerns we have about thinking about this is that you can have these natural changes, but what the principal problem now is we might really cross a tipping point in terms of our impacts in the atmosphere and then ultimately the planet. That causes serious problems overall, and we don't know how long-standing any kind of effect like that would be, even if we could find a corrective action. So the best thing overall is to try to avoid, to the best we can, any kind of crossing of a tipping point of that sort. So that's one.
We're approaching some
Yeah, well,
tipping
there have
points.
been designated levels that if we don't continue to reduce our output, our emissions output, we will cross a critical threshold.
And do you know what those levels are?
It's
And where we are now in relationship to those levels?
What we're saying now is we wouldn't want to have more than a 2-degree centigrade increase over background levels and over historical levels, and now recent historical levels, and now we're very close to crossing that threshold. Some people think we may have already. So,
and I would imagine that if we're approaching that threshold, it took some time to get there. Even if we were to make some dramatic changes, it's not going to continue advancing in that direction right away. Like it's not a switch that is flipped, and now suddenly we can, go back to the way things were or something like that. Or
yeah, that's an important point. I mean, for no other reason that carbon dioxide has a pretty long half-life in the atmosphere. So what's put in there is going to affect things for up to a century from now even, but hopefully if we can avoid adding to that.
Did you say a century? Wow.
Of course, it'll gradually be declining, but yeah.
Right, but still a century.
Yeah, so some of the
Time to get busy.
Yeah, well, yeah, there's no time to waste, really.
That's right,
yeah.
No time to waste. Yeah. So we know the cause of the oceans warming. The oceans are acidifying. This is having an effect on our very important fishing industry.
Mm-hmm.
How important is it economically to this region? And can you give maybe a little historical perspective on how important it was? In some of the research that I did, again, we were named Cape Cod because we had this extremely vibrant cod fishing industry.
Right.
It doesn't seem that way as much anymore, or maybe we've diversified over time for whatever the reasons are. But it's still a very important industry for this area.
Yeah, it is. So I guess one way to think about it is that it was one of the first recognized industry because there really wasn't much in the way of competition, among other things. I mean, other than that, we were in an agricultural setting overall in terms of how we operated in this environment at the very early stages in the colonization of this continent. But and of course, eventually, more and more other industrial type activities came to the fore. One of the first that really had a dramatic impact in New England was the textile industry, so on as a big industry. But so along the way, obviously, we're accumulating a much more diversified portfolio of types of industrial activities. Many of them problematic for the environment, of course, ultimately. But so
fishing kind of ruled for quite a long
period
of time.
Yeah, it did, and really put its stamp on the character of the country overall. And one of the issues that we're confronting now is the changes that have occurred over time, particularly with respect to climate, means that we've radically altered the temperature patterns, of course, in the ocean. I mean, and as it turns out, because of some of the oceanographic characteristics of where Cape Cod sits, we're in an area that's seawater temperature is increasing at a rate that's higher than almost 95% or more of the rest of the global ocean. So we're really in a hotbed in that sense in terms of how the change is occurring. And naturally, most of the animals we're talking about now for a fishery are, of course, cold-blooded animals. So every aspect of their biology and ecology is tied to changes in temperature. So overall, one of the things that we've been able to track over the last a century or more now from scientific surveys that have been done in Woods Hole is seeing a pretty steady, particularly in the last 2 to 3 decades, change in the distribution patterns of many of these organisms. More than 3/4 of the ones we looked at are changing pretty rapidly and moving towards the north to try to get into a more preferred temperature range. And one of the problems is that most of what we think about the really iconic species here that have contributed to our fishery, particularly cod, are haddock and others. They're really cold water species. I mean, cod, for example, populations of cod go all the way up to Newfoundland, Greenland, Iceland, and Norway, and so on. So they're used to being in cold waters, and we're right at the southern extent of their range here. So we're already on tenuous grounds in terms of what's going to happen in terms of temperature change. And so it's these species that are at the southern extent to their range that are most dramatically affected and started moving first. And of course that has real
effects
for the fishery naturally,
fishermen.
and also, so these animals are either moving to further north whenever they can, or to deeper water, or both. And so that makes it more difficult in terms of dealing with the overall changes in the system for fishermen, particularly those that don't have quite the range for moving and chasing fish, for example.
Is there risk of smaller populations or maybe even extinctions of certain species?
It certainly could be there certainly can be local extinctions, and that part of that process would be for moving populations that are now established in our area to move north, either through directed movement themselves or just having lower survival rates in the hotter areas and so forth. So those will eventually wink out. But the other part of the story too, it makes it more complicated, is that of course it isn't simply that we have a problem of fish moving out, but the whole ecosystem is reorganizing, in that we have fish fish and invertebrate species from further south that are moving into this area. So that does create some possibilities for opportunity for the fishing industry, but it's also the case that because we're so fundamentally altering the structure of the ecosystem, how actually it will coalesce into a new ecosystem form really isn't known just now. So
what's that time period that it takes for there to be this adaptation of an ecosystem into, or a species into, a new ecosystem?
Well, to be honest, I don't think we've ever faced a situation like this in terms of knowing exactly how it will unfold and how quickly or not it will unfold. You know, as you know, the history of the science, as I mentioned here, really goes back to late 1800s, which is pretty impressive at one level, but in terms of long-term changes in equilibration of ecosystems, it's not a long time. And this is one of the first opportunities to really see how it will unfold in terms of really massive perturbation to an ecosystem. And of course, an experiment we never wanted to do, but we have to learn how to adapt and move from there, and also to try to protect much of the fundamental structure of how the ecosystem works as possible. And obviously a lot of that is out of our control, not only just on the fishing, but because of all the other effects on the fundamental ecosystem, starting with those microscopic plants that I mentioned. You know, for example, last year we had one of the largest blooms of a particular type of phytoplankton called dinoflagellates that we've ever seen. And recorded through our scientific surveys, recorded. And we don't know how that will play out in terms of the food web overall, because the energy that comes in through those sources and different types of phytoplankton take different pathways in an ecosystem. So it's something that our best strategy is to try to track and understand what's happening. But in some respects, we're getting outside any playbook we had before.
So we have a vital industry to the area that's being affected by climate change, causing warming oceans and further acidification, which is causing the species that we were used to having in the area needing to migrate farther north because they prefer the colder water. And then we have species coming up from the south that are coming in. So that seems to me like that's got to affect the fishermen, because there's regulations and there's permitting to be able to fish certain types of species, right? Is it a sort of a collaborative group of these administrators, these fishing industry administrators, where they recognize this and it's like, sure, you know, you're not going to be able to fish cod so much anymore, but here's some striped bass, go out and get it.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a sort of a seamless transition type of thing, or is that problematic as well?
Well, it is problematic, and for one of the reasons you pointed out, the permitting system. So there's a couple fundamental issues that come to play here. First of all, starting when the 200-mile limit came in the mid-70s, a new form of fishery management was adopted by the United States, and it did set things like quotas for individual species, and for cod and haddock and these others. And they were, well, let me step back for a moment and say that in our system, the fish actually belong to all of the people. And fishermen who have a permit are given access rights to take a certain amount of fish or fish in certain locations or both. And but I think this is something that affects all of this because it really is your resource. We as the people here, and fishermen are the people that make that product available to us for the most part. Of course, many
and we're the
people
consumers.
We're the consumers,
literally,
yeah,
because we're
yeah,
consuming
at all
it.
levels. Of course, you know, people do go recreational fishing and so forth too to get their own and enjoy that. But so that connection is there, and we need the fishers and their skill and so on. But it also means that we really need to keep a handle on things so that we can continue in this industry, but is the people's industry in this case, really. I mean, that we're the owners of that resource. And so trying to understand and how we can work quickly in this kind of environment where things are changing so rapidly is difficult. And it is made more difficult by the permitting process because folks that hold a permit to be able to access a certain catch of fish, let's say it's cod, really are reluctant to release that and go to a totally new system. Now, I had been involved in some work starting 2 decades ago that tried to put in a different system in place that thought about not giving permit rights on an individual species basis, but think about the ecosystem itself and what could be legitimately and hopefully safely removed from different parts of that system, and not really tie it in so much to individual species because we recognize the cast of characters were changing, right? Maybe hopefully in the best of all worlds you'd have a situation where there are roles that are being played by different species, but let's say they're like an actor on the stage playing a role. Well, if one actor has to leave and could be replaced by another actor, then maybe that function can continue. Now, it's not going to continue exactly, obviously, because of differences, but the basic idea was to think about it as a system and not as a collection of parts, which is really what we're doing. And so we were trying to work through the ideas of setting quotas for groups of species that fill a certain kind of functional role in the ecosystem. So cod may go, but as you were mentioning earlier, striped bass, which is also another important fish predator, may come in to fill a niche in that regard, and so on. So the point is that the fundamental idea of having the catch allocated by individual species to individual fishers or groups of fishers because it becomes a constraint and an impediment because they don't want to give up that right. And we're going through that process right now, seeing that play out in management because we do have species now, for example, sea bass, black sea bass, that are coming up into our waters. They're a valuable species, but in New England, most of the fishermen don't have a record of catching them, and that's part of the process of being assigned a certain amount of catch. So,
does it require different equipment? Is that another
in some
contributing
cases
factor?
it can. In some cases it can. Now, in the case of black sea bass, they're sometimes caught in lobster traps, and well, not infrequently caught in lobster traps because they actually like the same kind of habitat that lobsters like, rocky reef. And so now, because of these temperature changes we've had, the lobster fishery south of the Cape is, starting in Buzzards Bay and going further south, is effectively defunct.
Really?
Because thresholds of temperature have been surpassed for lobsters, which once the water temperature in the summer gets above about 68 degrees, lobsters get in a lot of trouble. And so that's played out, and it's not the temperature alone, it's the interplay between the fishing and the temperature in this case, because if the animals themselves are stressed, the amount of additional pressure they can withstand, say from fishing, is reduced.
Is less, yeah.
So it's not, sometimes this is discussed as if it were an either-or thing, like fishing and climate impacts, and people would like to assign it to one or the other. But in fact, it's really deeply interconnected. So, but in any case, the way this has played out for lobster in the south, south of the Cape, has been very problematic. So, on the other hand, black sea bass are coming further north, as are blue crabs. They could also potentially be caught in our traps, but we don't have any history, catch history, that would give our fishermen here the right to take any of those. And I should back up for a moment and say I'm using the word fishermen because most, even female fishers, prefer to be called fishermen. So
okay,
and,
it's all good.
Yeah, it's all good. I should have perhaps explained that before, but so yeah, so it's a complicated system, and basically the permitting system that's in place now is a really serious source of inertia. It's not making us allow us to take the adaptive moves we really should be able to.
It seems like problems with permitting, I've heard that be an issue with many other things that are somewhat climate related, whether it's permits for offshore wind or permits for solar farms or permits for, I mean, it's not climate related, but it is density related, for bridges that need to be elevated because of, roads flooding as a result of, the effects of climate change. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in Massachusetts anyway, our legislature is trying to work, and our governor is in support of trying to work on expediting some of these permitting issues. Do they, is that also with regards to the fishing industry, that they're trying to expedite this permitting? It seems like the circumstances call for a little bit of nimbleness with regards to the permitting.
That's a good way to put it, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think there's a sense in which it might be a slightly different concern for certain types of permitting processes, which were, in many cases put in as safeguards for different potential problems that could emerge in, say, a construction of a new site and so forth. And
and ultimately, if I may just interject, ultimately the permits were to ensure that there was that reciprocity in that cycle, that fish were not, that we weren't overfishing in areas, so that we could. And I guess I want to give a shout out to fishermen that they appreciate that, because that's their livelihood. They want to be able to keep going back out there again and bring in a good catch. And so they understand, because this is a living model, the ocean is a living model, the species that are in the ocean are living things that themselves have cycles that they go through. If they want to keep being able to go out there and get them, there has to be, because we've over time have learned how to create this equipment that actually it's pretty remarkable and a little disturbing, that can actually overfish a species. We did it with the whales, even though we just had like little boats and harpoons, somehow they managed to do that. And we have the capacity to do that with the large fishing trawlers that we have, and, excuse me, the large organizations that we have. So these are good things, these permits, but for those purposes.
Right.
And yet, I would imagine there's this tension point between how do you write that permit so that it's equitable, that it keeps the cycle going, and now you interject the effects of climate on this environment, and you get pretty complicated and pretty
it does.
tense.
Yeah, I mean, and I will say that, you know, as you pointed out, I mean, fishermen are very keen observers of nature. They're very skilled, and they understand the behavior of the species that they're working with. They learn from experience, things like migration patterns and so on. And they do want to make sure that there'll be something in the future for them. So the stress that's coming now is that the species that they learned and drew all their experience from are leaving, you know. And of course, I should have pointed out earlier that we share, starting in the Gulf of Maine and on Georges Bank, a border with Canada. And so as these fish move further north, they're quickly, the species they're used to are out of our area and out of our area of responsibility.
Right.
So that puts in, you know, another stress onto the overall system as a whole. So now we're in a situation where they not only need to learn how they can harvest and understand the behavior of these species, and we on the scientific side need to try to help set the guidelines, or do set the guidelines in terms of what we believe would be sustainable in terms of removals. But the permitting, if they don't have the access to switch from one species that's now going out of their area to another because of basically conflicts over use by other fishermen further south who don't want to relinquish the quota shares they have, for example. So it becomes difficult.
I would think it becomes increasingly harder for that group of fishermen in the south to fish the species because it's moving north, and then they have to travel farther north. They can imagine, you know, go up to a certain area because then it becomes the next area, right? But that becomes more costly for them to have to do that. And the yields, I expect, are probably not as great. So it's
certainly not
there's not a lot of margin in the fishing industry, is that in terms of?
Well, like the options they have for adapting in this way with these changing species there are really three options they have. One of them is to do exactly as you say, move to try to chase the fish, and that can happen in two ways. One, they could continue to keep a home port that they currently have and travel further, and of course, as you quite properly pointed out, then the expense, if nothing else, is greater there, and the potential for conflict and competition with other fishermen already in that area becomes an issue. They can move their port to get closer to the center of mass of this new species, which isn't an easy adjustment or change to make either, on a lot of different levels. And then the third option that they have is really to, instead of thinking about chasing the fish that they once harvested and now are no longer available, to adapt to new species that may be coming into their area. So that's the part where some of the permitting story comes into play, and if they don't have the ability to do that, then a major option they have is off the table, at least until that can be resolved. So, you know, I guess what I'm trying to get at is the permitting is really an impediment to really adapting effectively and quickly, and in the meantime, more damage could be done to the resource.
Just one more point on that, and then perhaps we can move on to another section. Is it getting better, that permitting process, in recognition of these demands that are put on the industry with the result of, you know, migrating fish due to climate change?
There's a lot of interest in trying to solve it, but it's still yeah, there's a tremendous amount of inertia in trying to do this because it's also, it's unavoidable. There's a political dimension to this in terms of all of this, in terms of the competition between people from different areas and so forth, and that complicates it. So I would say that, yes, there's a recognition of the problem, and there are steps being taken to try to rectify it, but none have really come to fruition yet. And so, you know, as I mentioned earlier, I was hoping that we might be able to engineer a rethink altogether about what it means to be part of that ecosystem. Peripherally with, you know, other colleagues, but yeah, and obviously not as, you know, I'm retired from NOAA, so. So yeah, it's different, and I mean.
But I imagine you're retired, but it's still in your blood. Like
you
can't just give that up, a whole career that you were passionate about. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and that's true of all my colleagues. You know, it's really a labor of love, and they've decided if you go into a business like Fisheries as a scientist, you know, a major motivation is trying to have something that you do be immediately or near immediately valuable to or useful to society. And of course, all scientists want that as well, but sometimes that coming to fruition of your work can, you know, occur on different time scales. But if there's an immediacy for a management problem, then you know, it's different in that sense. But yeah, so I think, but it's true. I mean, scientists get hooked on this thing just because you're fascinated in trying to figure out how maybe some small part of the world really works, or at least as close as you can.
But it's just from talking with you, it's so impactful on so many different levels. What's happening in our oceans, because that has an effect on people's livelihoods. It has effect on what we eat, the quality of what we eat, whether it's available to be eaten, the cost of what it is. It affects, and this fishing industry is right now sort of valued at around like $20 billion.
Yeah,
and
so
that's nationally or just in the New England region. I think it's just in the New England region, right?
Nationally, the fishery, the value of the fisheries in terms of what they'll call ex-vessel value, the amount that gets landed, is almost $300 billion nationally.
Oh, wow.
Now, for Massachusetts alone, it's been estimated that that landed value is about $750 million.
That what value again?
The ex-vessel value, what they get paid at the dock. Now, in that case, what happens is when an economist is trying to understand the role of the fishing industry in that way, they apply what they call a multiplier effect for how does that money of what gets landed at that dock contribute to the broader economy, whether it's fishing processors or boat companies or
the other jobs that are.
And so from that point in Massachusetts, the most recent estimate I've seen for the value in that sense, this expanded value, is about $2.3 billion. Now, it's one estimate I saw for Cape Cod alone would be that the Cape would account for about 9% of that. So
this is an important industry still
on
the Cape,
absolutely,
with regards to our sort of the vibrancy of our economy, and that then has an effect on so many other parts of the economy here.
Yeah, exactly.
So what are the ways that we can affect some positive change in the industry? There's a term I will use, sustainable fisheries management. What exactly is that? What does that mean? What is that?
So it goes back to that early idea that I mentioned, that you know, the task for, if you're providing advice for a single species, you try to determine basically what is a safe level of removal. Now, one of the removals overall, and that could be used to set either a level of fishing pressure that would be recommended, or maybe how much you could take out total from that resource. So the important thing about that is it's based on an idea that the world works in an equilibrium fashion. That is, things balance out, and you could expect some long-term stability overall that would guide you in terms of determining how much of that stable level could be safely removed without really endangering the renewal of the resource over time, because obviously the value of it is a renewable resource. So one way to think about the problem we're dealing with now is, and of course, let me back up for a moment and say that there's always environmental change and other factors that give you ups and downs over time in a resource like this.
Nothing operates in a
but
vacuum.
The basic theory was that if you could identify a relatively stable level around which the population would fluctuate. But it's pretty clear we're in anything but a stable or equilibrium system now, because of the magnitude of the perturbations that are coming out because of climate change. And so that kind of perspective really, for now, isn't really helpful to us, because it's not an idea that holds overall in a broad enough sense to make it useful. And we really do need to think about, well, how do you really manage a non-equilibrium system?
And we've said that, and we know, based upon what science, the information that science has been able to provide us, that the climate change is caused by the excess of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. So it seems like the reduction of them would help to bring the system back into a balance. But as we mentioned earlier, that's going to only happen over a prolonged period of time.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So we need more immediate steps. And my own personal opinion is that we need to rethink how we deal with the system like this. And most of the constraints that I mentioned in terms of what fishers are asked to do, in terms of either how much fishing or how much to take out, those really revolve around the idea of extracting a resource, which isn't all that uncommon in we think about other things, whether they're renewable, whether it's forestry or other activities. But it's really fundamentally saying you can take so much. Now, because we're on such uncertain ground, and what I'm about to say, I think actually held even before then, but what we really should be thinking about is, how do you manage things to maintain resilience, and then let natural processes take their course. And then if we don't disturb the flexibility the system has to adapt to change, then at least there'll be some stream of
How do we
flows.
do that?
Well, there's a couple of key things, and one of them, to my mind, and one of the most important, is to do everything we can to maintain diversity in the system, both biological and ecological diversity, but also human diversity in the sense of the types of fishing activities that are undertaken by people. And of course, there are other elements of human diversity that are critical to this, having better representation overall of different segments of society as an option for them. But really, it's the pyramiding system cuts right to the very heart of that as an impediment of this idea of diversity, because remember, you're being told you could take so much of species X and so much of species Y. That's not the way the fishing industry used to work. Back in time, they would be much more flexible in terms of the species they could pursue and land. And
you're
they
saying
worked
that
it out.
that's a better system?
It allows, it's more diverse in the sense of the freedoms that it gives to people to adapt, fishers to adapt, And we can manage it in a way, I think, that prevents really any imbalances in the system. But
So are you saying instead of going for a particular species, go out and fish and catch a variety of them? Is that
catch a variety and catch them at much
Smaller.
smaller rates than what
Smaller
we're
rates,
currently
yeah.
take. So
But that has impacts, well, that sounds like obviously it sounds like a good solution, but so lesser rates or smaller catches, if you will, but more frequent catches? Because
Well,
I'm
just
thinking
because
if you reduce the amount of fish that a fisherman brings in, you're reducing his income. And they're expecting to have a certain income because that's what provides them with the ability to, it's their livelihood, pays their bills, pays their workers,
Yeah, so the idea is that, that's an important point, and it's right at the heart of this, but what you're trying to do is to have it so that because the range of species that they can harvest, but at a rate that's less likely to cause any problem for any individual species, they could catch as much and probably make as much money as they did before. So that, and on the other hand, if you keep targeting individual species and you keep hitting them until they get driven to very low levels, then you necessarily have reduced the diversity overall in the system. So this idea of diversity comes in that sense, in terms of trying to maintain a sense of balance, and as I was saying earlier on, to make sure that the functional roles in the ecosystem are maintained. And we've had a number of instances in this country, particularly when foreign fleets arrived off our shore and they weren't under control. We only had control of the waters out to 12 miles, and they decimated a lot of the stocks that are now, that were off our coast on Georges Bank and in the Gulf of Maine and elsewhere. And so they drastically changed the ecosystem structure when they did that. And I think in many ways, we're still trying to recover from that. There's, legacy effects or that come into play, or what's sometimes called path dependence.
So fishermen have also, in their resourcefulness, have also started to adopt some different types of, not just different species of fish, but different species altogether. I'm thinking of the aquaculture industry that seems to be flourishing a little bit, flourishing more. Is that, I guess that can kind of contribute to what you're saying, is have, maybe you don't go out for, it's not just fish or shellfish, that you go for, but you gather, kelp, which is an important food source. It's becoming a more important food source. So they're showing they're showing further resourcefulness and adaptability, the fishermen, by taking on these types of new products.
Yeah, no, you're right about that, Lynn. One of the issues that comes up, though, is that the types of vessels, the boats that they have, and the gear that they have are aimed at usually a particular set of target species, at least whether if it's your lobster fisherman, it's traps. If you're a dragger, toad net, then you're really set up to do that kind of work. And yes, there is flexibility to adapt and change to try to, for example, among other things, harvest new species that may be coming into the area. Now, if you did take the step to do aquaculture or raising kelp, then it's a different sort of system in terms of what you'd want for the operating gear, both in terms of any vessels that are involved.
So it's a different investment. You have to really be thinking about.
You'd really be starting over
again,
which is, in the other sense, you could try to have some continuity. Not that you wouldn't change either the behavior once you begin to understand what this new species that you're.
But as we started our conversation, you know, with what's happening to our oceans resulting from climate change, adaptability is important, is necessary. It's not just important, but it's necessary.
Yeah.
And you know, the fishing industry is a very historical industry. It's a very generational industry. It's hard for people to make those shifts, right?
Right.
Unless the reason is important enough or serious enough. I would think livelihood, you know, being able to maintain a livelihood is one. And if going into a different, either going for a different species or going into something like kelp harvesting, that could, you know, that could demonstrate benefits for them and enable them to be able to continue, you know, staying more or less in the field that they love.
Yeah.
They love.
Yeah.
I'd like to talk a little bit, if we can. There's been a lot of changes, especially locally, to many of our scientific institutions as a result of some of the changes to our environmental programs, in terms of changes with the number of people that are able to continue to work in our scientific institutions. Can you speak to that a little bit, and what's that what's that impact not only for us in our community, but also the ramifications to the broader scientific community and the contributions that the scientific community actually make to our lives?
Yeah, yeah.
That's a big question.
Yeah, but thank you for bringing it up. You know, I had mentioned earlier on, well, let me back up for a moment and say that the kinds of changes that are coming online, of course, have direct effects immediately on federal employees. But because so much of the scientific community here overall in Woods Hole depends on grants and other sources that are also at risk, that it literally affects everyone. But of course, the first line of attack has been on the federal employees, and so to me, it's heartbreaking to see what's happening, because I know these dedicated people that work so hard, and in some cases they're being denigrated by people who have no idea what they actually do and what their commitment to this work really means to them and what it really means to society. It's just some thing to chop off, some funding to chop off. So, you know, this plays out on a very personal level, but also it also has fairly immediate effects on the ability of the agency to carry out its work. So one of the things that's really important and unique about, for example, the Northeast Fisheries Science Center in Woods Hole is the sheer diversity of the scientific talent that's there. So you have in that our institution there in the satellite labs for the Northeast Fisheries Science Center in Milford, Connecticut, and Sandy Hook, New Jersey, and so on. You have people that are looking at everything from climate, oceanography, the basic fundamental elements of the ecosystem, starting with phytoplankton that we mentioned and going on, all the way up to the ecosystem effects of fishing, and then on to what are the social impacts. So there are both anthropologists and economists at the center who are working on these parts of the story. And because of the broad scale that's involved with this, both in terms of that broad scope of responsibilities, but also the fact that we're responsible for working from the area from Cape Hatteras all the way up to the Canadian border. There's no way to do anything like that unless you do it in a teamwork environment. So once you begin to chip away at team members that are playing one vital part in one part of the story, the whole gets weakened. And so I think
Those that are left can't do their job effectively because
yeah, I mean,
need that
the scope
collaboration.
and the scale and scope of what needs to be done is really pretty immense when you think about it. You know, I mean, I've worked at universities, had professorships and so on, and that's a really vibrant environment, and you're working with students, but oftentimes you're operating for research either with very small teams of colleagues or, you know, grants that you yourself have. And you can choose the problem, you decide this is the playing field I want to be on and this is a tractable problem. It's really different than when you're trying to address a societal problem that's not driven by tractability, but the reality of how complicated the real world is, and you're trying to find out how to deal with it. And you just need, you know, a good team to be able to bring together all the parts, and not only that, but, you know, to make sure that you coordinate in a way that you come out with a product that can be really helpful overall to society. And that gets damaged very early on when you begin to chip away with that. And in particularly the kinds of cuts that have occurred so far, which were people who are on probationary status. They are new to the agency, and the way this works, you for the first year, you have a probationary period where you don't have the full protections and rights for a scientist that's been at the agency longer. And most often that's disproportionately affecting young scientists coming in. So here you have people that are coming in at the start of their career. They're excited to be able to do research that they strongly believe in and want to.
They're doing it at Woods Hole, which is one of the premier places in the world.
Yeah, couldn't be in a better place.
Yeah.
So, in any kind of an institution at all, whether you're talking about business or anything, I mean, the young people coming in that's really the lifeblood of the institution and the group. And so, by affecting in particular that group, you know, it has a disproportionate impact on what the future might look like. And similarly, on the other end of the spectrum, if they're trying to force people who are in retirement age out early,
you lose
you lose that
experience.
you lose that experience and that memory. And in particular, I think the agency that I worked with was very forward thinking in that when you were preparing to retire, one of the things you would do would be to sign mentorship, a role with other younger scientists to try to pass on what you've learned and how you have learned to operate in this system and so on. And so when things like this are abruptly cut off, then you're really affecting two ends of the spectrum of a very, you know, dynamic workforce. And so I think it's particularly unfortunate that both in the way this is being done and the purported reasons it's being done.
What can be done at this level to try to sort of change the administration's view and perspective on, you know, why they made these decisions? It seems to me as if in the interest of having reductions in force to help reduce our federal budget, we actually might be having things cost more because there's this fallout from not being, existing projects that are going on right now that have to come to a stop. That's a waste of all the money that was spent on it, all the work that was spent on it in advance. Right. And then you don't get, the project doesn't get to go to its conclusion, which has its benefit, which has, I'm sure, some sort of some monetary value to it, a societal value, which we don't know how to monetize that, but it does have a monetary value to it. It doesn't how do we sort of, if you will, like better educate those that made these decisions? It's not just about the money, because all of these, as you alluded to, all of these institutions, whether they're here in Woods Hole, but it's impacting us very much right now because it's happening right now. The societal value that they've provided, the scientific value that they have provided, is probably one of those things that you might not even be able to quantify it, but it's extreme, far more than what we might be saving with these cuts, right?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. I mean, I think to take the climate issue, to try to remove all climate research so that we can make better decisions about how to deal with what we're currently facing and how to best adapt and mitigate and prevent further harm. The loss of that information and what it'll mean to society a decade or more beyond is very likely incalculable, but also very clearly much beyond anything that would be saved. You know, first of all, the federal workforce is no larger now as a whole than it was in Dwight Eisenhower's presidency. So this idea that there's a sprawling and cancerous growth of the federal employees is simply wrong.
Are you talking about federal employees across all departments?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So, you know, there's no small amount of scapegoating that's going on that's just, you know, as in so often in these discussions, not backed by facts. And so I think that folks really realized how things operate in the federal government, and realize that some of the things they're being told about how it operates are not correct, that it would be an important contribution to this overall discussion. But as far as I can see, the only short-term way to cope with this is either for Congress and or the legal system to kick in and take up their responsibilities in terms of how to manage this issue of checks and balances and understanding what the benefits of the federal government workforce really are. And it's much more critical and much less, you can't get tremendous savings from doing what they're doing. It's just too small a part of the budget, but because it's something that apparently has become convenient to scapegoat, that you know, it's being carried out, and without very much care and thought as far as anyone can see in terms of how these are being implemented.
Well, I feel like we're fortunate here in Massachusetts because we have legislators and we have a judicial system that wants to support and support our scientific community and argue against these changes. And what we can do as individuals is make sure that they know that we are behind them in that effort.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, no, I think that's an important thing. And you're right. I mean, right from our very local level representatives all the way up into the State House in Massachusetts and the governor, we do have very strong support, and it's an able partnership. So that, and we're grateful for that. And also, you know, from the turnout that we had in the Stand Up for Science rally, you could see that it's a broad thing within the community. So, and I can tell everyone that the scientific community is very grateful for that support that was shown.
Well, we're very grateful to our amazing scientific community for all of the work and contributions that they have made, especially in the area of climate change. We've gotten a lot of answers. We know what we need to do. We just need to do it now, right? Yeah. So, Mike, I want to thank you so much for being here with me.
It's great to talk.
This has been a wonderful conversation, an important conversation, And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us here at Climate Matters. If you'd like to learn more, please contact us at falmouthcan@gmail.com. Have a great day.